A single slip of paper, pencil scratched across it in a hurry. "Benteen, come on, big village. Be quick, bring packs." That was the last order ever sent from Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Read it once, and it sounds like a command. Read it again. Listen to the hand that pressed the pencil down. This isn't a general closing in on victory. This is a man who has already heard the dirt hit the lid of his own coffin. A man calling out from a trap that hasn't snapped shut yet, but the teeth are moving. That note is the sound of a world ending. The hand that received it belonged to Captain Frederick Benteen, a veteran. A soldier who knew how war works, and a soldier who knew exactly who George Custer was. Benteen hated him. Months before, in a private letter, he had called Custer a madman. He was certain that vanity would one day bury them all. Now the gunfire was rolling across the bluffs in the distance, and in his fist was a scrap of paper begging him to ride. History turns on this second. When Benteen stared at those frantic pencil strokes, what did he see? A commander who needed saving? Or the man he despised, finally meeting the end he had earned? An order to obey? Or a chance to look the other way while a tyrant was wiped off the map? That small moment of possible betrayal is only the tip of something much larger. Underneath it sits a pyramid of broken promises, a government tearing up a sacred treaty the moment gold winked at them from the Black Hills, a commander shredding his direct orders, betting the lives of his troopers on a sprint for headlines and a possible road to the White House, and rifles betraying the men who carried them, jamming into useless metal in fingers slick with sweat and blood. The Little Bighorn wasn't a battle. It was a debt collector. Years of broken promises, broken orders, and broken faith, all coming due on one hot afternoon in Montana. Comment which city and country you're watching from down below. And if you believe these stories need to be told, take a moment to subscribe. It is the single best way to support this project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. To understand the man who built this disaster, you have to start with the costume he wore. Because George Armstrong Custer wasn't really a person to the American public. He was a poster, the boy general. Long blonde hair tumbling past his shoulders, buckskin jacket cut tight at the waist, cinnamon-scented oil rubbed into those famous curls, a cavalry saber at his hip, and a reporter at his elbow. In the years after the Civil War, no soldier on the continent was more photographed, more printed, more sold to the public than him. He had earned the first chapter of that fame in blood. At Gettysburg, on July 3, A.D. 1863, he led the Michigan Brigade headlong into J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry at East Cavalry Field. He shouted, "Come on, you Wolverines," and crashed straight into the Confederate line. He was 23 years old. Horses were shot out from under him, 11 during the war, bullets through his sleeves, hats knocked off his head. He kept rising. By the time Lee signed at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, A.D. 1865, Custer was a major general by brevet. The small parlor table where the surrender was signed was given to his wife Libby as a gift from General Sheridan. Sheridan included a note. He said no man had done more to bring the war to its end than her husband. Then Custer taught himself something even rarer than courage. He learned how to sell himself. He brought journalists like Mark Kellogg of the Bismarck Tribune on campaign and fed them his version of events. He sat for portraits by Matthew Brady in poses borrowed from medieval paintings. He wrote his own book, My Life on the Plains, published in A.D. 1874. Captain Frederick Benteen would later call it My Lie on the Plains. Custer understood decades before anyone else in uniform, that a hero is whoever the newspapers say he is. He was a brand before the word existed. But peel the buckskin back, and a different face appears. He graduated dead last out of 34 cadets at West Point in June A.D. 1861. His record showed 726 demerits over 4 years, almost a school record. His personnel file was a slow-burning fire of reprimands and boards of inquiry. In September A.D. 1867, the Army court-martialed him at Fort Leavenworth and suspended him for a full year without pay. The charges were not small. He had walked off his post at Fort Wallace in the middle of a campaign against the Cheyenne to slip away and visit Libby at Fort Riley. He had ordered 3 deserters shot on sight, no trial, no hearing. One of them, a private named Charles Johnson, took 3 days to die from a head wound in a wagon. Custer forbade the surgeon from treating him. He had refused to ride to the relief of Lieutenant Lyman Kidder's detachment when they were attacked. Kidder and 10 troopers were found scalped and mutilated near Beaver Creek in July A.D. 1867. Inside the officer corps, the truth about him was an open secret. Captain Albert Barnitz wrote to his wife that Custer was the most complete example of a petty tyrant I have ever seen. Many of his subordinates considered him a vain man who treated his regiment as a personal stage, a man whose ambition was a loaded pistol everyone around him had to keep an eye on. By the spring of A.D. 1876, that ambition had teeth. In March of that year, Custer had been summoned to Washington to testify before Congressman Heister Clymer's committee. The committee was investigating corruption inside the War Department of Secretary William Belknap. Custer testified that Belknap and President Grant's own brother, Orville, were running kickback schemes at the trading posts on the frontier. The testimony was a sensation. The newspapers loved it. President Ulysses S. Grant did not. Grant was so furious he tried to strip Custer of his command of the 7th Cavalry entirely. Only after General Sherman and Terry intervened was Custer allowed to lead his regiment into the field at all. He rode out of Fort Abraham Lincoln on May 17, A.D. 1876, a man trying to redeem himself in headlines. In the saloons and back rooms of Washington, his name was being passed around as a possible Democratic presidential candidate for the centennial election. A spectacular victory over the Lakota and Cheyenne would be the perfect final act. The Democratic National Convention was set for St. Louis on June 27th. One clean, headline-friendly triumph, ridden straight from Montana into the White House. He wasn't preparing a campaign. He was preparing 2. And here is the worst part. This war he was riding to win was a war he had personally lit the fuse on. The ground had been promised. The Fort Laramie Treaty of April 29, A.D. 1868 was no scribble. It was a formal pact signed by General William Tecumseh Sherman for the United States and by Red Cloud, the Oglala war chief for the Lakota Nation. Red Cloud had refused to even come to the table until every American fort along the Bozeman Trail was abandoned and burned. He got what he asked for. Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith, Fort Reno, all abandoned in the summer of A.D. 1868. The Lakota torched the empty stockades themselves. The treaty guaranteed the Black Hills, the Pahasapa, to the Lakota. Forever. The treaty used the strongest language American law could write. The land was for their absolute and undisturbed use and occupation. No white settlers, no surveyors, no railroads. Article 16 specifically barred the United States from sending soldiers into the territory without Lakota consent. The United States swore it on paper, on ink, on its own honor. To the Lakota, the Black Hills were not real estate. They were the heart of the world. The place called Wind Cave, near present-day Hot Springs, was the door through which the first people emerged onto the earth. The granite spires were the bones of ancestors. Bear Butte, on the northern edge, was the mountain where Crazy Horse himself had received his vision as a boy. The promise lasted 6 years. Then came the whispers of gold. On July 2nd, A.D. 1874, Custer led a column of 1,000 soldiers, geologists, photographers, 3 newspaper reporters, and a 16-piece regimental band out of Fort Abraham Lincoln. The band played Gary Owen as they rode. The column stretched 4 miles across the prairie. They drove straight into the Black Hills, straight into the treaty he had personally sworn to defend. The official cover story was that he was scouting for a fort site. Nobody believed it. Nobody was meant to. He found what he came to find. On July 30th, near a place his men named French Creek, the miners Horatio Ross and William McKay panned the first colors. Custer's dispatch went out 2 days later by his fastest scout, Lonesome Charlie Reynolds, who rode 90 miles through hostile country to reach the telegraph at Fort Laramie. The dispatch lit up newspapers from New York to San Francisco. There was gold, Custer wrote, from the grassroots down. 5 words. That was all it took. The country was already bleeding. The panic of A.D. 1873 had collapsed banks, shuttered factories, and thrown 1 in 4 New Yorkers out of work. Men were desperate. The dispatch reached them like a starting pistol. A flood of prospectors poured into the Sacred Hills. By the spring of A.D. 1875, the mining camp of Custer City had 11,000 people in it. The Army made limp gestures of stopping them, then stepped aside. When the Lakota and Cheyenne fought to defend the land that had been guaranteed to them by federal treaty, American newspapers gave them a new label: hostiles. The government had broken the promise, started the gold rush, and watched the Lakota react exactly as any nation would react to an invasion. Then it framed that reaction as the crime. In September A.D. 1875, a commission led by Senator William Allison met with the Lakota at Red Cloud Agency and offered $6 million for the Black Hills. Spotted Tail asked if it included the gold. The commission refused to answer. Red Cloud asked for an amount large enough to feed 7 generations. Little Big Man rode through the council on horseback, stripped to the waist with a Winchester across his arms, and said he would kill any chief who signed. The commission left empty-handed. An ultimatum went out on December 6, A.D. 1875. Every Lakota band off the reservation must report to an agency by January 31, A.D. 1876, or be treated as enemies of the United States. The order had to travel across hundreds of miles of frozen plains in the dead of winter to bands that had no telegraph and no calendars. Many runners never got through. Sitting Bull's camp on the Yellowstone received the message in mid-February. By then, the deadline was already 2 weeks dead. It was designed to be impossible. Custer had pointed at the henhouse, kicked in the door, and now volunteered to lead the hunt against the birds for fighting back. His arrogance walked into Montana ahead of him. General Alfred Terry, his commanding officer, offered him 3 Gatling guns from the 20th Infantry. Each one was a brass-barreled, hand-cranked beast, capable of 350 rounds per minute. One of them could break a charge. 3 could turn a hillside into a slaughterhouse. They had been used to devastating effect against Plains tribes only 2 years earlier at the Red River War. Custer refused them. He claimed the guns and their condemned horse teams would slow his column. The truth was simpler. Gatlings were ugly. They were heavy. They belonged to engineers and gunners, not to a man with golden hair on a horse. He was a cavalryman. He wanted hooves and sabers, not cranks and tripods. Terry tried again. He offered to attach 4 veteran companies of the 2nd Cavalry, under Major James Brisbane, to Custer's command, about 160 extra trained troopers. Brisbane himself begged Terry to be allowed to ride along. He had a bad feeling. Custer refused them too. He told Terry, in front of other officers, that the 7th Cavalry alone could handle anything on the plains. The boast wasn't tactical, it was territorial. If reinforcements came, the headlines would have to be shared. He didn't want shared headlines, he wanted his name alone at the top of the column. Every choice he made was an act of narrowing. Narrowing the credit, narrowing the witnesses, narrowing the glory until only one man stood inside it. But the worst refusal wasn't about weapons or men. It was about knowledge. The 7th rode with 35 Arikara scouts under their interpreter Fred Gerard, and 6 Crow scouts on loan from General Gibbon's column. The Crow leader was a man named Mitch Boyer, half French and half Lakota, who had been raised in the country they were now riding through. He spoke 6 languages. He could read a single hoof print and tell you what tribe, what direction, how many hours old. As the column pushed deeper into Montana along Rosebud Creek, the scouts began to find things that stopped their breath. On June 24th, they came across an abandoned Sundance circle. The dance pole still stood. 3 white scalps were tied to it. Inside the lodge floor, drawn in colored sand, was a picture of dead soldiers falling upside down. Bouye studied it for a long time. The next morning, before dawn, the scouts climbed to a ridge called the Crow's Nest, 14 miles east of the Little Bighorn Valley. The air was thin and cold. They lay on their bellies in the grass and squinted into the gray distance. What they saw was something they could not measure. Smoke. A horizon of smoke. They could not see the village itself, hidden behind a final ridge, but they could see its pony herd grazing in the bottoms. A living carpet of horses spread across the valley floor. Bouye estimated 20,000 animals, which meant thousands of warriors. Bloody Knife, Custer's most trusted Arikara scout, told him plainly. Too many. Bloody Knife was the half-Lakota son of a hunk-papa mother. He had been raised among the same people they were about to attack. He knew this enemy from the inside. He told Custer they would find enough Sioux to keep them fighting 2 or 3 days. Mitch Bowyer said something colder. He told Custer that if he rode into that valley, they would all go home today by a road they did not know. Then the Arikara did something the soldiers had never seen them do. They began to wash their faces in the cold creek water. They unbraided their hair. They painted yellow streaks across their cheekbones. They sang their death songs in low voices that traveled across the grass. This was not theater. This was a ritual performed by men who had calculated their odds and arrived at 0. Custer heard them out. Then he sneered. He told Bloody Knife to ask the sun god whether they would live to see it set. He called the scouts frightened by shadows. The shadows were holding rifles. Many of those rifles were better than the ones the soldiers carried. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors had been trading furs at the agencies for years, and a fair number of them now owned Henry and Winchester repeating carbines. 16 shots without reloading. The 7th Cavalry carried the Model 1873 Springfield carbine. Single shot. Breech loading. Copper cartridge cases that softened in the heat of rapid fire and jammed inside the chamber. The soldiers were about to ride into the future carrying the past. His contempt for his enemy was the soil all of his decisions grew from. He could not picture a native force standing its ground against a disciplined American regiment. In his head, they were savages who would scatter at the first bugle. They would run. They always ran. That single belief was the foundation of his final plan. On the morning of June 25, A.D. 1876, with the Little Bighorn snaking through the valley below, Custer made the decision that ended him. He split his command. 650 men divided into pieces. 3 companies, H, D, and K, went to Captain Frederick Benteen, about 125 troopers. Their orders: ride south and west, sweep the bluffs, cut off any escape in that direction. 3 companies, A, M, and G, went to Major Marcus Reno, about 140 troopers. Reno was a Civil War veteran who had never once fought Indians. He had been drinking from a flask of whiskey since dawn. Their orders: charge straight into the southern end of the village. 5 companies, C, E, F, I, and L, stayed with Custer. 210 men. He would swing wide to the north and crash into the village from the flank, the hammer driving panicked people into Reno's anvil. 1 company, B, under Captain Thomas McDougall, stayed in the rear, dragging the slow pack train of 160 mules. The pack train carried the spare ammunition, 26,000 rounds, every soldier's lifeline. It was not a battle plan. It was a roundup. The strategy had worked for him before, at the Washita River on November 27, A.D. 1868. He had hit Black Kettle's sleeping Cheyenne village from 4 directions at dawn. They had killed Black Kettle, his wife, and over 100 others. Many were women and children. Custer left the field so fast he abandoned Major Joel Elliott and 19 troopers who were surrounded and killed. Benteen had been there. Benteen had never forgiven him. The Washita doctrine was simple. You hit the village from multiple angles at once. You break the warrior's nerve before they can form a line. You catch the women and children before they can flee. The 3 columns close like a net. The whole net depended on one assumption: the enemy would run. He was so certain that he skipped the basic step every soldier learns first. He did not properly scout the village. He did not count it. He did not measure it. His Arikara scouts told him there were enough Sioux to fight him for days. He answered that they would all go home together after one charge. He thought he was about to land the decisive blow of his life. He was riding into a city. The village in the valley below stretched 3 miles along the river. There were 6 camp circles: Hunkpapa, Oglala, Miniconjou, Sans Arc, Blackfeet Lakota, and Northern Cheyenne. Modern estimates count around 8,000 people in the camp. Around 2,000 of them were warriors of fighting age. It was the largest gathering of Plains nations anyone living could remember. And while Custer galloped forward inside his own legend, the village he could not see was already waiting for him. Not nervously, not in fear, with certainty. 2 weeks earlier, on Rosebud Creek, the Hunkpapa Lakota holy man Sitting Bull had performed the sun dance. His nephew White Bull cut the pieces from his arms with a sharpened awl. 100 small cuts, 50 from each side. The blood ran in lines down to his fingers. Then Sitting Bull danced, staring straight into the sun, hour after hour, until his body gave out and his vision opened. He saw soldiers, many soldiers, and horses too, falling from the sky like grasshoppers in a storm. Their heads were pointed down. Their hats were falling off. They were tumbling straight into the Lakota camp. A voice told him these soldiers had no ears, meaning they would not listen. The holy men interpreted it as a gift from Wakantanka. Soldiers delivered into their hands. Soldiers without power. Soldiers already finished before they arrived. But the vision came with one warning. The warriors must not take anything from the dead. Not weapons, not clothing, not scalps. If they did, the gift would curdle. The vision moved through the encampment like wind through grass. 8 days before Custer arrived, on June 17th, A.D. 1876, the prophecy had been tested. 1,000 warriors led by Crazy Horse had ambushed General George Crook's column on the Rosebud River, only 30 miles to the south. Crook had 1,500 men, infantry, cavalry, and Crow and Shoshone allies. He was supposed to be the southern jaw of the pincer, closing on the Lakota. After 6 hours of fighting, Crook withdrew. He retreated all the way back to his base camp on Goose Creek and sat out the rest of the campaign. Custer did not know it had happened. No messenger ever reached him. The Lakota and Cheyenne knew. They had beaten one army 8 days ago. Their power was rising. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, thousands of warriors, Crazy Horse, Gall, whose 2 wives and 3 children had been killed by Reno's first volley not long after, 2 moons of the Cheyenne, Hump, lame white man, husbands and fathers and grandfathers. They were not gathering to defend a camp. They were gathering to answer a prophecy. When the dust of Custer's column finally rose on the horizon, it did not surprise them. It confirmed them. The soldiers were not invaders anymore. They were an appointment kept. Custer, gripping his vanity like a rein, saw a primitive camp ready to scatter. They saw a man God had already promised them. I need to pause here for a moment. Putting these stories together, tracing them from broken treaties, to private letters, to spiritual visions on the plains, takes more research and more time than most people realize. Ancestral is not a corporate machine. It's a mission to tell these histories the way they deserve to be told. With weight, with respect, with the brutal honesty that the dead earned. If that mission matters to you, if you feel like you belong here, then I want to invite you to join The Lineage. It's our membership here on YouTube. When you join, you stop being only a viewer. You become part of the team that keeps this channel independent. You become a patron of the work. You get early access to investigations. You get exclusive material. And you help make sure these stories never go silent. Join the ranks. Custer was riding into a trap that had been built on 4 layers now. Warriors hidden in the coulees. A vision burning in the camp. A victory 8 days fresh in their hands. And his own ego, the largest cage of all. He had refused the Gatlings. He had refused Brisbane's reinforcements. He had refused his own scouts when they laid the truth at his boots. He did not know about the Rosebud. He did not know about the Sundance vision. He did not know that the warriors at the other end of the valley were not waiting to run. They were waiting to collect. Ahead of him, behind a ridge he had not bothered to climb, waited a force that outnumbered him 3-1, that outgunned him with repeating rifles, and that was certain, down to the marrow, that the Great Spirit had already handed him over. Major Reno's 3 companies were about to splash across the Little Bighorn first. The water was knee-deep on the horses. The cottonwoods on the far bank were thick with green leaves. The dust they kicked up climbed straight into the sky like a signal flag announcing their arrival. They would be the first to learn what was actually waiting in those cottonwoods, and what happened to Reno's men in the next 20 minutes, what they saw, what they heard, and what came roaring out of the dust to meet them, would tell every other soldier in the 7th Cavalry, in one screaming instant, exactly what kind of day this was going to be. The slaughter starts with metal, not flesh, not yet. Metal. The United States 7th Cavalry rode into the Little Bighorn carrying the Model 1873 Springfield carbine. On paper, it was a fine weapon. 45 caliber, 55 grains of black powder behind a 405-grain lead bullet. Effective range of 400 yards. The Army's Ordnance Board, chaired by General Alfred Terry himself, had selected it over the Remington rolling block and the Winchester repeater after testing at Springfield Arsenal in AD 1872. The board's logic was simple. A single-shot rifle taught soldiers to aim. A repeater taught them to waste ammunition. The Springfield had a problem. A small one. A fatal one. Its cartridge case was made of soft copper. The Army had chosen copper because brass cost more. The decision was a line item in a budget passed by Congress in AD 1871, 3 years before anyone knew it would be tested in a real fight. When the carbine was fired again and again, the barrel grew hot. The copper case grew hotter still. Under heat and pressure, the metal expanded inside the chamber and gripped the steel walls like glue. The extractor, a small claw at the rear of the breech, was supposed to yank the spent case out and clear the way for the next round. Under hard use, the extractor ripped straight through the copper rim. The case stayed put. The gun stopped working. A trooper named Charles Windolph, who survived on Reno Hill, later testified that he had seen the same jam happen to his own carbine during training at Fort Lincoln. He had reported it. Nothing was done. 48 pounds of trooper, 8 pounds of carbine, and a piece of jammed copper the size of a fingertip was now all that stood between a man and a Cheyenne lance. Archaeology has put the proof in our hands. On August 10th, AD 1983, a wildfire ignited by a discarded cigarette burned across the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument and stripped 100 years of grass off the slopes. Teams led by Richard Fox and Douglas Scott walked the cleared ground with metal detectors over the next 2 summers. They mapped 4,186 artifacts. Across the last stand positions, in the dirt where men had died, they pulled up dozens of copper cases. The cases carried tiny scratch marks, small frantic notches gouged near the rim. Those marks were left by knife tips. You can picture the moment. A trooper on one knee in dry June grass that crunches like paper under his weight. His horse already shot, lying 20 feet behind him, ribs still rising and falling. His carbine silent. He fumbles his belt knife from its sheath. He digs the blade into the soft copper and tries to pry the case loose, his fingers slipping on sweat and powder soot. He smells burnt grease and his own urine. Behind him, the high, yipping voices of warriors are getting closer, the sound rolling up the draw like wind. He digs. He digs. He never fires another round. For dozens of men, that small scratching motion was the final act of their lives. The carbine designed in the arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts, to save them, became a length of useless wood and metal in their hands, a 4-foot club. The technology problem was only half the equation. The popular myth says the warriors fought with bows and stone clubs. That is a comforting lie. They had bows. The bows were lethal at close range, silent, fast, and a skilled archer could put 6 arrows in the air before the first one landed. But they also had something the soldiers did not. Repeaters. Through the agency trading posts at Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Red Cloud, and Spotted Tail, and through illicit traders along the Missouri at places like Fort Peck and Fort Berthold, the Lakota and Cheyenne had been quietly acquiring Henry rifles and Winchester Model 1866 and Model 1873 carbines for nearly a decade. Brass-framed, lever-action, tubular magazines, 16 rounds before reloading. A trader at the Cheyenne River Agency named John Smith, called Yellow Hair by the Lakota, was later proven by Senate hearings in AD 1877 to have sold over 200 Winchester carbines and 40,000 rounds of ammunition to warriors he knew were not coming in to the reservation. The cartridges came in waxed cardboard boxes stamped with the Union Metallic Cartridge Company seal from Bridgeport, Connecticut. Archaeologists later cataloged cartridges from at least 47 different firearm types fired by the warriors at the Little Bighorn: Spencer carbines, Sharps rifles, Henrys, Winchesters, Smith & Wesson revolvers, Colt Navy revolvers from the Civil War. A few captured Springfields. Even a single trapdoor cartridge fired from a stolen carbine of the 2nd Cavalry that had been lost during Crook's fight on the Rosebud 8 days earlier. A trooper with the Model 1873 carbine, working calmly on a quiet range, could fire perhaps 8 to 10 aimed rounds in a minute. In combat, with a jamming weapon and a shaking hand, 3 or 4. A warrior with a Winchester could empty 16 rounds in under 30 seconds. The United States Army, sent to subdue what its newspapers called primitive savages, had walked into a fight where its own firepower was outclassed. This is the truth Marcus Reno discovered first. At about 3 out in the afternoon on June 25, AD 1876, Reno splashed his 3 companies across the Little Bighorn at a shallow ford the Lakota knew as Minnepusa. The water was cold against the horses' bellies, fed by snowmelt off the Bighorn Mountains 100 miles to the south. A and M and G troops, about 140 officers and enlisted men, 40 Arikara scouts trailing. He had whiskey on his breath. Witnesses later testified to the flask in his coat. Reno had been drinking since dawn. His wife, Mary Hannah, had died of typhoid the previous July at Harrisburg. He had not stopped drinking since. He spread his men into a skirmish line on the flat valley floor, 3/4 of a mile from the southern edge of the Hunkpapa Camp Circle. Standard cavalry doctrine: every 4th man holds 4 horses. The other 3 fight on foot at 5-yard intervals. He expected what Custer had promised him: a village in panic, people running, a clean charge into chaos. The village did not run. It came at him. Out of the lodges poured hundreds of warriors. Some had been napping in the afternoon heat. Some were halfway through eating boiled dog, which the Lakota considered a sacred meal. Many had spent the previous night in the social dancing that follows a victory, because they had been celebrating the defeat of Crook on the Rosebud 8 days earlier. They were tired. They were also ready. They grabbed bows, rifles, revolvers, war clubs, hatchets. They vaulted onto the nearest pony and rode toward the dust line of the soldiers without waiting for orders. A Hunkpapa war leader named Gall took command of the countercharge. Gall was a big man, 6 feet tall. His real name, Peedsy, meaning gall bladder. Years before, he had been bayoneted 3 times by soldiers from Fort Berthold and left for dead in a snowbank. He had crawled away and lived. He carried the scars on his chest and his back. When Reno's first volley had ripped across the southern lodges, 2 of those bullets had killed Gall's 2 wives. A third had killed 3 of his children. He would later tell a reporter at the 10th anniversary of the battle that his heart became bad that day. After that, he killed soldiers with the hatchet. Crazy Horse was still in his lodge in the Oglala Circle, painting himself for war. Hailstone marks across his cheek, a single red lightning streak down his face, a small brown pebble behind his ear, the medicine Black Elk's cousin Chips had given him as a boy. A single hawk feather in his hair. He would not ride out until the 2nd phase of the battle, when the cry came from the north that Longhair himself was on the ridge. Reno's skirmish line held for maybe 10 minutes. The grass in front of his men was waist-high, buffalo grass and prairie sage, dry from a hot June. The bullets cut the stalks down in lines. Powder smoke hung in the still air at face level, because there was no wind in the valley that afternoon. Men were firing at the muzzle flashes of warriors they could no longer see. Then his line bent. Then it broke. The bullet that ended everything for Marcus Reno did not hit Marcus Reno. It hit the man next to him. Bloody Knife, his lead Arikara scout. The man who had warned Custer the night before that they would not all see another sunset. Bloody Knife had been born to a Hunkpapa mother and an Arikara father around AD 1840. He had grown up among the same people he was now fighting. As a boy, he had been beaten and humiliated by a young Hunkpapa named Gall. A rifle round struck Bloody Knife in the head at close range. His skull came apart. Pieces of bone and brain and a long jet of blood sprayed across Reno's face, into his open mouth, across the front of his blue blouse. The Major froze. Witnesses afterward, including the interpreter Fred Gerard, who was 3 feet away, said Reno's eyes went glassy for several seconds. Then he shouted an order. He countermanded it. He shouted another. He countermanded that one, too. He yelled at his men to dismount, then to mount, then to dismount again, then, finally, to ride. It was not a retreat. It was a panic crystallized into motion. Lieutenant Donald McIntosh, half Scottish and half Mohawk, was killed trying to keep his G Troop platoon together near the timber. He was 38 years old and the son of a Hudson's Bay Company trader. Lieutenant Benjamin Hodgson, Reno's adjutant, was shot from his horse and grabbed the stirrup of a passing trooper. He was dragged 20 yards through the water before a second bullet finished him. The trooper kicked free and kept riding. The river crossing became the killing floor. The bank where the soldiers tried to climb out was a 4-foot vertical wall of clay, rust red from iron in the soil, slick from the splash of horses already through. Horses piled up against it. Some fell backward into the water. Men were crushed. Others were shot from the saddle and dragged downstream by their own stirrups, their boots tangled in the leather. The Little Bighorn ran red in patches for nearly half a mile downstream. A Miniconjou warrior named White Bull, the nephew of Sitting Bull, later described shooting a soldier whose horse had been killed in the river. The man was on his hands and knees in the shallows, crawling toward the far bank. White Bull shot him through the back of the head from 20 feet away with a Winchester carbine he had won the previous summer from a horse trader. Dr. James DeWolf, an Army surgeon and graduate of Harvard Medical School, made it across the river. He started climbing the bluff on foot, leading his horse by the reins. Warriors above him on the ridge shot him down before he reached the top. He was 33 years old. His wife Fanny was waiting for him in St. Paul. Father Vincent de Paul, a Catholic priest who had been visiting Fort Lincoln, had blessed the column before it left on May 17th. He had made the sign of the cross over each company in turn as they rode past. Dr. DeWolf had received that blessing 38 days before he died, face down in Montana clay. By the time the surviving fragments of 3 companies dragged themselves up the bluffs on the eastern bank, Reno had lost 3 officers, 32 enlisted men, and 3 scouts killed in less than 30 minutes. Another 7 were wounded. Around 15 were still missing in the cottonwoods below. Among them was Lieutenant Charles Varnum's friend, Lieutenant Charles DeRudio, an Italian aristocrat who had once been arrested for trying to assassinate Napoleon III with a bomb in Paris. DeRudio would hide in the brush for 36 hours before crawling back to the surviving command. Custer's anvil had been smashed before the hammer even arrived. Custer never knew it. 4 miles to the north, climbing along the bluffs above the river on a ridge the Crow called Greasy Grass, Custer was looking down at the unprotected northern half of the village. From his vantage point at a place now called Weir Point, he could see roughly half of what was there. The Cheyenne Circle, part of the Oglala camp, the pony herd. He could not see the eastern side of the village, hidden by terrain. He could not see the women, children, and elders who had already begun fleeing north when Reno's attack started. He could not see Crazy Horse forming up his warriors on the far bank to ride upstream and cross at a ford called Medicine Tail Coulee. He sent his Italian-born bugler, Giovanni Martini, riding back with the famous note scribbled by his adjutant, Lieutenant William W. Cook. Cook wrote on a small leaf torn from his order book, in pencil, his hand shaking with adrenaline. The slip of paper survives today in the West Point Museum. Martini, born Giovanni Martino in Sala Consilina, Italy, on January 24, A.D. 1853, had served under Giuseppe Garibaldi as a drummer boy during the campaign against the Bourbons in A.D. 1860. He had emigrated to America in A.D. 1873 because there was nothing left to fight for in Italy. He spoke broken English with a heavy accent. He would be the last white man to see Custer's battalion alive. As he rode south, an arrow grazed his horse's flank. He kept the note dry inside his fist. While that note traveled in Martini's hand, Frederick Benteen was finishing a march that had taken him exactly nowhere. Custer had sent him southwest at noon with orders to scout the bluffs for fleeing Indians and to pitch into anything he found. He had found nothing. No fleeing villages, no hidden camps, just dry ridges and panting horses and a single dead Indian pony with a broken leg. He had grown more bitter with every step. Privately, he was certain Custer had sent him on the errand specifically to keep him out of the glory. Benteen was 41 years old. He had 4 buried children, all dead before age 5 from spinal meningitis. He had been a Union officer from a slave-holding Virginia family. His own father had disowned him for fighting for the North. He had killed his first man in combat at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in A.D. 1861, and had never once shown the strain of any of it. Other officers called him cold. They called him a thinker. They called him the only man in the regiment Custer was actually afraid of. Around 2 in the afternoon, he turned his column back toward the main trail. Then Martini found him. The trumpeter's horse was bleeding from a bullet wound in the hindquarters, a steady drip leaving a trail across the prairie sage. Martini handed over the note with hands shaking from the ride. Benteen read it once, then again. In the distance, from the north, he could hear gunfire, heavy and continuous, rolling across the valley like thunder you can almost set your watch by. Volley fire in measured intervals. The kind of firing officers order when they still believe they have a position to hold. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He did not pick up the pace. His second-in-command, Captain Thomas Weir of D Troop, asked permission to ride ahead with his own company toward the sound of the guns. Benteen denied it. Weir would ask again in 20 minutes, and again 20 minutes after that. A few minutes later, his 3 companies came over a rise and saw the river valley spread out below. They saw the bluffs across the water, and on those bluffs, dragging itself toward higher ground, was the broken thing that had been Reno's command. Hatless men, bare-headed officers with no swords, horses lathered to a foam, their flanks heaving, a line of dust rising behind them, and a thinner line of warriors picking at the rear of the retreat. Reno saw Benteen. He spurred his horse down toward him, with his head still smeared in Bloody Knife's dried blood, a black crust running from his forehead to his collar. According to witnesses, his first words were, "For God's sake, Benteen, halt your command and help me. I've lost half my men." Now, Benteen held 3 things at once. A direct written order from his commanding general to come quickly and bring the ammunition packs. The sound of that commanding general's battle still raging to the north, 4 miles away, and a shattered battalion of his fellow soldiers in front of his face, begging him to stay. He chose to stay. He sent a small detail back to find Captain Thomas McDougall's pack train and bring up the ammunition. McDougall escorting 160 mules, was still over an hour behind. Benteen ordered his men to dismount on what would become known forever as Reno Hill, a flat-topped knob of dusty earth rising 200 feet above the river. He told them to dig. There were no spades. There were no entrenching tools, because cavalry units did not carry them. They used knives, tin plates, mess cups, cracker boxes pried open and emptied. Dead horses and mules dragged into a perimeter to soak up bullets, the animals still warm, still bleeding from the mouth. The sound of metal scraping dirt mixed with the sound of distant gunfire rolling down the valley from the north. Captain Weir could not stand it. At around 4:45 p.m., without orders, he mounted his D troop and rode north along the bluffs toward the sound of the firing. He covered about a mile and a half before he reached a high point, now called Weir Peak. From the summit, he raised his field glasses. What he saw on the distant ridge to the north stopped him cold. He saw a hillside swarming with hundreds of mounted warriors. He saw dust. He saw warriors riding back and forth, shooting down at something on the ground. He saw what looked like a few small figures, still moving among the dead horses. The firing was already slowing. Historians have argued for nearly a century and a half about what was in Frederick Benteen's mind during those minutes back on Reno Hill. In a letter written years earlier to his wife Catherine, he had called Custer a man whose vanity would destroy them all. He had stood on the field at the Washita in A.D. 1868 and watched Custer abandon Major Joel Elliott and 19 troopers to their deaths in a draw 2 miles from the main column. He had attended Elliott's funeral. He had memorized the position of every cut on the bodies. He had written an open letter to a St. Louis newspaper that February, signed only with his initials, accusing Custer of cowardice. Custer had stormed into his tent with a riding whip in his hand and threatened to horsewhip the author. Benteen had stood up calmly, drawn his service revolver, and told Custer to begin whenever he was ready. Custer had walked out. Now, on a hot Montana ridge, he held a note in his pocket from the same man begging for help. And the gunfire from the north was beginning to thin. Was his choice a sober military judgment? A senior captain refusing to throw 2 more battalions into a slaughter he could not see? A man saving the only soldiers still alive within his reach? Or was it something quieter and colder? An accountant settling an old debt? A man holding a piece of paper and letting time finish a sentence that had been started at the Washita 8 years before? The Reno Court of Inquiry, convened in Chicago in January A.D. 1879 at Reno's own request, would spend 26 days picking through this question. The court ultimately cleared both men of cowardice. It would not address the moral question. It could not. We cannot read what was in his heart. We can read what he did. He stayed, he dug, he listened. And in that act, the 210 men still riding north with George Armstrong Custer were marked. Custer was the hammer. Reno had been the anvil. The anvil was broken. The hammer was alone now, swinging into open air. To the north, the sound of his battle was beginning to change. The volleys came in long, ragged bursts at first, disciplined, controlled. 40 carbines firing as one. Then they came in shorter, scattered crackles, individual shots, then handfuls of shots, then long pauses between them, pauses growing longer. Before we walk onto that ridge with the men who are about to die there, I want to put something into your hands. The research for this episode rests on one of the most exhaustive accounts of the Little Bighorn ever published. A book that strips the legend down to the bone. That walks you, hour by hour, through what really happened on that ground. That foundation made today's story possible. And you can own it right now. Tap the View Products button on your screen. The book is sitting there waiting for you. If you want to feel the full weight of what we covered today, that volume belongs on your shelf, but there is more inside that shelf. We've gathered a selection of relics tied to this era, to the frontier, to the cavalry, to the wars on the plains. I won't list everything, because our collection keeps shifting and growing. But I want you to open the shelf and look. Find what speaks to you. Take a piece of this history home while the story continues. Open the shelf now. Browse. Listen as we ride north. Because what waited for Custer on that long ridge above the river was something no soldier in the United States Army had ever seen before. Not at the Washita, not on the Yellowstone, not at Wounded Knee Creek, which would not happen for another 14 years. Not in any campaign of any war on the continent. 2,000 warriors, coming in 3 waves, from 3 directions, at once. Gall sweeping up from the south, his hatchet still wet. Crazy Horse circling wide to the north and crossing at Medicine Tail Coulee to come in behind. 2 Moons and the Cheyenne pressing in from the west, and the men of C, E, F, I, and L troops were about to find out, over the next 40 minutes, that the river crossing behind them had already been cut. There was no anvil to drive the enemy into. There was no retreat. There was no relief column coming. There was only the ridge, the wind, and the slow tightening sound of a noose drawn by hands they could not see. Captain Weir, on his peak a mile to the south, lowered his field glasses. He turned to his sergeant. He said something the sergeant remembered for the rest of his life. "My God, Sergeant, we are too late. The legend everyone learned in school looks like an oil painting, a tight circle of doomed troopers. The boy general at the center, his long blonde hair lifted by the wind, sabers drawn, pistols barking, a wall of warriors crashing against them like a tide breaking on a rock. Heroes selling their lives by the inch. It is one of the most reproduced images in American art. Anheuser-Busch alone printed over 150,000 copies of Cassily Adams's Custer's Last Fight between AD 1896 and the AD 1940s, distributing them to saloons across the country. The picture hung above the bar in towns where men drank beer and learned how to remember. A child sitting at his father's elbow in a Kansas tavern in AD 1910 learned the battle from that painting before he ever read a book. Nearly every detail in that painting is wrong. Custer did not have long hair that day. He had cut it short before leaving Fort Lincoln on May 17, AD 1876, a fact his wife Libby wept over in a letter to her sister Mary. Nobody drew a saber. Custer had ordered all sabers left behind in boxes at the Powder River Supply Depot on June 22nd. He thought they were heavy and useless. He was right about that. He was right about almost nothing else. There was no circle. The dirt itself told the truth a century later. When archaeologists Richard Fox and Douglas Scott mapped the cartridge cases across the battlefield in AD 1984 and AD 1985, they did something nobody had thought to do before. They treated the battle like a crime scene. They tracked individual firearms across the ground by the unique firing pin signatures stamped onto each spent case. They could follow one specific Winchester from the southern end of the village all the way up the ridge, watching its owner move with the action. What the cartridges showed was the opposite of a stand. They showed a collapse spread across nearly a square mile. They showed warrior firing positions on every side of every soldier position. They showed soldier positions abandoned almost as fast as they were occupied. They showed troopers shot in the back as they ran. The painting was a comfort. The dirt was the truth. The first part of Custer's command to break was Lieutenant James Calhoun's L Company, posted on a low ridge to the south, now called Calhoun Hill. Calhoun was Custer's brother-in-law, Married to his sister Margaret since March of AD 1872. The family called him Jimmy. He had been a regular at Libby's parlor evenings in the officers' quarters at Fort Lincoln, reading aloud from Dickens while she poured tea. He was 31 years old. His company tried to hold a skirmish line facing south. They never saw what hit them. A Cheyenne war leader named Lame White Man led perhaps 40 warriors on foot up the backside of the ridge, through a gully thick with sagebrush and prickly pear. Cavalry doctrine assumed Indians always fought mounted. Cavalry doctrine had never met Lame White Man. He came up through the brush low and quiet, his men in a single file behind him. They rose out of the grass 30 yards from Calhoun's line and emptied their rifles into the troopers' backs. L Company died in under 10 minutes. Most of its bodies were later found facing south. The bullets had come from the north. Lame White Man himself was killed minutes later, mistakenly shot by another Lakota warrior who took his looted blue army shirt for a soldier's. His name in his own language was Mo'otavetu'o, more accurately translated as Bearded Man. His wife, Twin Woman, mourned him for a full year and never remarried. The collapse rolled north along the ridge to where Captain Miles Keogh held I Company. Keogh was Irish, born at Orchard House in County Carlow on March 25, AD 1840. He had ridden as a papal zouave in defense of Pope Pius IX in AD 1860, fighting at Castelfidardo and Spoleto before sailing to America to fight for the Union. He carried a small silver medal of the Agnus Dei around his neck, blessed by the Pope himself, alongside a Catholic medal of St. Patrick given to him by his sister Margaret in Ireland. He was found wearing both. The warriors who stripped his body left the medals alone, sensing they were something sacred. The medals were eventually returned to his sister in Ireland by a fellow officer, Captain Edward Settle Godfrey. Keogh's men, most of them Irish and German immigrants, who had taken the Queen's shilling once and now took Uncle Sam's, made the last organized resistance of the battle. The cartridge cases pulled from his position showed groups of 3 and 4 troopers fighting close together. His own horse, a bay gelding named Comanche, purchased in St. Twain. Louis in AD 1868 for $90 was found 2 days later with 7 arrow wounds and a bullet through the neck. Comanche survived. Farrier Gustave Korn nursed him back to health over months at Fort Lincoln. The Army made him a regimental mascot. He never carried a rider again. By standing order of Colonel Samuel Sturgis, only one man, Korn himself, was ever permitted to lead him. When Comanche died in November AD 1891 at Fort Riley, he was given a full military funeral with draped saddle. He is one of only 2 horses in American history to receive that honor. His body was preserved by Louis Lindsay Deich and still stands today in the Natural History Museum at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. After Keogh's pocket dissolved, there was no command structure left. Custer's remaining men streamed north toward a knob of land slightly higher than the surrounding ridge. It is the spot tourists visit today. The white marble markers stand there scattered, never in a circle. The first markers were placed by Captain George Sanderson's men in AD 1879. The current marble blocks were set in July AD 1890. They mark the spots where bodies were found. They do not mark a defensive line because no defensive line existed. They were not retreating to that hill. They were being driven to it. Crazy Horse had crossed the river at Medicine Tail Coulee and circled wide to the north. He came in from behind them. Gall pushed from the south. 2 moons of the Cheyenne pressed from the west, where the village was. The 3 forces met on the ridge with the soldiers caught in the middle. A Hunkpapa warrior named Ironhawk, who was 14 years old that day, later told the writer John Nehart in AD 1931 what he saw. He said the dust was so thick he could not see his pony's ears. He said the noise was something he had never heard before. The screaming of horses, the popping of guns, men shouting in English words he did not understand. He said he counted coup on a soldier with a willow stick because he was too young to carry a real weapon. The soldier was already dead. Black Elk, then 13, rode onto the field after the firing slowed. He later told Nehart he saw a soldier kicking his foot weakly in the dirt, as if trying to stand. He shot the soldier with an arrow because his mother had told him to bring back something to prove he had fought. He kept the soldier's scalp locked for the rest of his life. The real ending did not happen on the famous hill. It happened in a place the Lakota called Deep Ravine. As the perimeter on Last Stand Hill broke, a group of around 28 men from E Company, the Gray Horse Troop, made a desperate run for the river. Every horse in E Troop was a gray, by Custer's personal order. They had been visible from miles away that morning, a column of pale shapes against the dry prairie. Now, what was left of them ran downhill into a steep, narrow gully cut by spring runoff into the soft clay. The walls of the ravine rose 10 feet on either side. The bottom was muddy and uneven. They believed they could follow it down to the cottonwoods along the water. They could not. Warriors lined both rims. The Miniconjou white bull, the Cheyenne wooden leg, the Oglala he-dog. From above, they had open shots straight down into a trench full of men who could not climb out. Wooden leg, in interviews recorded by Thomas Marquis in AD 1922, described it as shooting fish in a barrel. He said one soldier tried to climb the wall with his hands and was shot in the back of the head. He said another lay down in the mud and pretended to be dead and was killed by an arrow anyway. He said the bottom of the ravine became slippery with blood that did not soak into the clay. He said the smell of opened bowels carried up out of the ravine in a way that stayed in his nose for years. The bodies of E Troop were piled at the bottom of Deep Ravine in a single mass. To this day, those remains have never been recovered. The first burial party, led by Lieutenant Edward McGuire on June 28, AD 1876, threw dirt over them where they lay. The ravine has slumped and shifted in the decades since. Excavations led by Douglas Scott in AD 1984, AD 1989, and AD 1994 confirmed disturbed soil, but did not find the bones. 28 American soldiers still lie somewhere in that hillside, in a grave nobody has been able to find. This was the real last stand. Not a stand, a drowning in dirt. The mutilations that followed have been used for 150 years to prove a single point about who the savages were. That point was always a lie. The Lakota and Cheyenne believed that a person crosses into the next world in the same body they leave this one with. The marks left on the dead were not random violence. They were theology applied with a knife. A trigger finger removed, a hand cut off, tendons cut behind the knee, eyes pierced, ears slashed. Each act disabled the soldier's spirit for what came next. A man without a trigger finger cannot pull a trigger in the spirit world. A man with cut tendons cannot hunt buffalo. A man without ears could not hear his ancestors call him home. Scalping cut a man free from his name. It was not desecration. It was a sentence carried into eternity. Some bodies received special attention. Captain Tom Custer, George's younger brother, had won the Medal of Honor twice during the Civil War, once at Namozine Church and again at Sailor's Creek, where he personally captured 2 Confederate battle flags in 3 days. He was the only soldier in the Union Army to win the medal twice. He had personally arrested the Hunkpapa warrior Rain in the Face at Standing Rock Agency on December 14, AD 1874, for the murder of 2 civilians the year before, a sutler named Honsinger and a veterinary surgeon named Ballerin. Rain in the Face had escaped from the Bismarck guardhouse in April A.D. 1875 and sworn within hearing of the guards that he would cut Tom Custer's heart out and eat it. Tom Custer's body was identified only by the tattoo on his right forearm. His initials, TWC, a goddess of liberty, and an American flag, done in India ink by a sailor friend in Cleveland in A.D. 1865. The skull was crushed flat. The torso was opened from sternum to groin. Arrows had been driven into his thighs to pin him to the ground. His heart was missing. George Armstrong Custer was found near the top of the famous hill, lying across the body of another soldier. He had 2 bullet wounds, one in the left temple, slightly above the ear, one in the chest, below the heart. Either would have killed him. The wound in the temple showed no powder burns, meaning he was not shot at close range. The chest wound was almost certainly the first hit. The temple wound delivered after he was already down. His body was not scalped. It was not mutilated. There is a small, sharp incision in his left ear that may have been the start of an act the warrior abandoned. Why he was spared has produced theories for 150 years. One explanation says he was not recognized. He had cut his famous hair short. In the buckskin coat he wore that day, he looked like any other officer. His rank insignia had been torn off in the looting. His boots and pants had been pulled from his body, leaving him in only his cotton undershirt. A second explanation says he was recognized and left alone out of respect for a chief who had died bravely. The third explanation comes from the Northern Cheyenne, preserved as an oral tradition kept by Kate Bighead, who was present in the village that day and watched the battle from a hill above the river. In her account, given to Thomas Marquis in A.D. 1922 and published in his book Custer on the Little Bighorn, in A.D. 1927, 2 Cheyenne women came upon Custer's body after the fighting. They recognized him. They had met him years before during the Peace Council on Sweetwater Creek in the spring of A.D. 1869. He had smoked a pipe with the Cheyenne chiefs Medicine Arrow and Little Robe in their lodge. He had sworn never to fight the Cheyenne again. The chiefs had warned him that if he broke the pipe, the everywhere spirit would destroy him. The women knelt down beside his body. They pushed the point of a sewing awl deep into each of his ears. They said it was so that he would hear better in the next life. He had broken the promise of the pipe. He had broken it at the Washita that same winter. He had broken it again here. In the next world, they said, perhaps he would listen. Another Cheyenne tradition, carried in the family of Buffalo Calf Road woman of the Northern Cheyenne, claims something more startling. Buffalo Calf Road woman had already become famous 8 days earlier at the Rosebud fight, where she rode into the middle of the battle to rescue her brother, comes in sight after his horse was shot. The Cheyenne still call that fight the battle where the girl saved her brother. At the Little Bighorn, the family tradition says she was on the ridge when Custer was unhorsed. She struck him from her pony with a war club. The blow did not kill him, but it knocked him off his feet at the moment a bullet found him. She would die 5 years later, in A.D. 1879, of diphtheria during the imprisonment of her people at Fort Robinson. If the story is true, the man sold to America as the Cavalier ideal was brought down by a woman on a pony with a wooden club. The news of the defeat traveled slowly. The steamer Far West, captained by Grant Marsh, was waiting at the mouth of the Bighorn River with General Terry's supplies. The 52 wounded survivors from Reno Hill were loaded aboard in the early hours of July 3, A.D. 1876. Marsh draped the deck in fresh-cut grass to cushion the men. Then he made one of the great runs in steamboat history. 710 miles down the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers to Bismarck in 54 hours. The Far West arrived at the Bismarck levee at 11 o'clock at night on July 5th. Captain Marsh tied a black flag from the mast. The telegraph office was already closed. The operator, J.M. Carnahan, was woken from his bed. He sat down at his key and tapped out the news for the next 22 hours straight, fueled by black coffee and brandy brought to him by the newsroom of the Bismarck Tribune. The very paper Mark Kellogg had been writing for. Kellogg had died with Custer, his body found near the river, his pencil and notebook still in his shirt pocket. The news hit the East Coast on July 6th and reached Philadelphia, where the Centennial Exposition was still open. 5 million visitors had filed past the Corliss steam engine and Alexander Graham Bell's new telephone since the May opening. The papers had been full of progress, invention, and a triumphant young republic standing tall against the world. Then the wire came in from Montana. President Ulysses S. Grant was at his cottage in Long Branch, New Jersey. A reporter from the New York Herald asked him for a statement. Grant, who had detested Custer since the Belknap testimony 3 months earlier, said in a low voice that Custer's death was a sacrifice of troops, brought on by Custer himself, that was wholly unnecessary. Wholly unnecessary. Grant said it once. He never said it again in public. Nobody could. The country needed a hero, not a cautionary tale. So the story was built. Within days, poet Walt Whitman published A Death Sonnet for Custer in the New York Tribune. By the end of July, Frederick Whitaker was already writing the first biography of Custer, A Complete Life of General George A. Custer, which would appear in December A.D. 1876 and create the heroic template that lasted a century. The arrogant fool who had refused Gatling guns, refused reinforcements, refused his scouts, refused even basic reconnaissance, became the gallant cavalier dying nobly on a hill. The battle became Custer's last stand, a phrase that traveled into the language and never left. The battlefield itself was renamed Custer Battlefield National Monument by executive order in A.D. 1881, naming the ground after the loser, erasing every warrior who had won there. Libby Custer was 26 days short of her 34th birthday when her husband died. She would live until April 4th, A.D. 1933, dying 4 days before her 91st birthday in her apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan. She outlived almost everyone who could contradict her. She wrote 3 books defending her husband: Boots and Saddles in A.D. 1885, Tenting on the Plains in A.D. 1887, and Following the Guidon in A.D. 1890. She lobbied generals and senators. She received a monthly pension of $30 from a special act of Congress. She kept the myth alive for 57 years and made certain nobody dared challenge it while she breathed. Captain Benteen privately said her writings were of a piece with her husband, lacquered with the same varnish. The men of the village paid their own prices. Sitting Bull, who had seen the soldiers falling from the sky in his vision, fled north into Canada in May A.D. 1877 with around 4,000 of his people. They settled in the wood mountain country of Saskatchewan. The buffalo failed. By A.D. 1881, his people were starving. He surrendered at Fort Buford, Dakota Territory, on July 19, A.D. 1881. He handed his Winchester to his 8-year-old son Crowfoot and told him to give it to the soldiers so that the boy could say his father had been the last Lakota to lay down his rifle. He was killed by reservation police at Standing Rock on December 15, A.D. 1890, during a confused arrest tied to the ghost dance movement. He was 59. Crowfoot, hiding under a bed in the cabin, was dragged out and shot also. He was 17. Crazy Horse surrendered at Camp Robinson, Nebraska, on May 6, A.D. 1877, less than a year after the Little Bighorn. He brought with him 889 of his people and 2,000 horses. He was bayoneted by a private named William Gentles On September 5th, those of that same year, while resisting being placed in a guardhouse cell. He was 35. His parents wrapped his body in a buffalo robe and carried it away on a travois. The location of his grave has never been disclosed by his descendants. Gall surrendered in AD 1881 and became a judge on the Standing Rock Reservation. He converted to Christianity and worked with the Episcopal Church. He died of an overdose of medicine in AD 1894. Two Moons died in AD 1917 and is buried under a stone cairn in Busby, Montana. Major Marcus Reno was court-martialed in AD 1880 for drunkenness and conduct unbecoming an officer. He had been caught peeping through a window at Colonel Sturgis's daughter Ella. He was dismissed from the Army on April 1st, AD 1880. He died of cancer of the tongue in Providence Hospital, Washington, D.C., on March 30th, AD 1889, in poverty, his name shadowed by what had happened in that valley. In AD 1967, his great-nephew successfully petitioned the Army to overturn the court-martial. His remains were reinterred at the Custer Battlefield National Cemetery with full honors. Frederick Benteen retired as a colonel in AD 1888 and died in AD 1898 in Atlanta. He never publicly admitted to any failure on Reno Hill. In private letters to his friend Theodore Golden, he wrote that he had no regrets about how he had used the time after he received Custer's note. He never explained what he meant. He is buried in Arlington. The battlefield kept its old name for 115 years. On December 10th, AD 1991, President George H.W. Bush signed Public Law 102-201, renaming it Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. In AD 2003, after 25 years of advocacy by Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho elders, an Indian memorial designed by John Collins and Allison J. Towers was dedicated on the ground itself, opposite the obelisk that listed the Cavalry dead. It had taken 127 years for the winners to be allowed to stand on their own ground. The deepest betrayal of the Little Bighorn was never delivered with a bullet. It was delivered with a story. The men in the village were turned into villains. The man who threw his own command into the meat grinder was turned into a saint. The truth was buried under prints sold by a beer company, statues raised by a grieving widow, and a phrase repeated so many times it stopped meaning anything at all. What really happened on that ridge was simple, and the dirt has been telling it for 150 years for anyone willing to listen. A vain man led good men into a fight he had not bothered to look at. They died for his ambition. The people who killed them were defending their homes against an invasion that had been promised would never come. And then a country that could not face its own reflection painted over the whole scene and sold it back to itself as glory. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the bottom of this story. If something in it moved you, leave a comment below telling us where you watched from, tap like, and share this video with someone who still believes the painting. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Now look at your screen. The next investigation is already opening. Another buried chapter, waiting for you to walk into it. Tap it. Watch it now. Keep descending.